I want to straight jump to the background. Why accessibility? And what is accessibility? Accessibility in simple terms would mean, accessibility in built environment particularly, that anybody, everybody should be able to use built environment without depending anybody. So that means with independence, without any barriers, with dignity, and they should be able to go in, pass to and from, and make use of a built environment safely. So that is accessibility in terms of law. Last year, in 2016, India ratified this law. It's called Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. You will see the name has person first, disabilities later. So it's a person's first approach. So section 40 of this law specifically talks about that central government, in consultation with the Chief Commissioner, formulate rules for persons with disabilities, laying down the standards for accessibility for the physical environment, transportation, information, communication. So accessibility is not just of built environment. So you have accessibility of transportation, you got accessibility of information. So how information is provided to people, that is accessible to all. I give an example. For example, had there been an officer who was hearing impaired, or a person with hearing impairment, an officer with hearing impairment, he wouldn't have been able to access what I'm saying, right? So in that case, a sign language interpreter over there and the text over there would have made it accessible to him. Had there been a blind officer, how do you make it accessible? They can listen, of course. So the talk can be heard by them. If there are notes, the notes have to be in accessible, readable format. So generally, you have your official communications generally scanned, put on the websites in image formats. So very often this image format is not accessible to blind users. So accessibility is a whole, it's a huge, huge area. We're just touching upon the built environment. It also talks of appropriate technology and systems and other facilities and services provided to public in urban and rural areas. So accessibility is a huge, huge provision. I'll leave out the access to transport. Access to information technology is pretty important because this is when you design buildings. Nowadays, buildings have also components of information. You got a call, doorbell. You got systems, automatic control. While I'm on the way, I'm just switching on my, my Apple, and my AC is on, my refrigerator is on, or my, other things are on. So it's very information enabled, and these all things need to be accessible. So once law provides it, gradually we need to have them in the standard. So this is how, when the law provided, BIS thought, no, let's make it more compliant. Let's look at international best practices. We already had, an international standard, 21542, which is dealing with the subject. So we took a lot of guidance from that. And finally, the NBC 2016 provisions on accessibility were, brought to the fore. Section 44 talks about mandatory observance of accessibility norms under this law, which says, no establishment shall be granted permission to build any structure if the building plan does not adhere to the rules formulated by the central government under Section 40. It also says that no establishment shall be issued a certificate of completion or allowed to take occupation of a building unless it has adhered to the rules formulated by the central government. So, in nutshell, after the law has come into being, no building which is inaccessible can either be, passed, or if it is already being constructed, it cannot be occupied by any person. So it has to be accessible. The Act also talks about time limits, and Section 46 talks about, for services it says 2 years. When I say service, any organization which is providing services, I hope you jumped one section. Any organization that is providing services need to be accessible. Services, for example, I would take an example of a hospital. A hospital is providing service, or a coaching center, for example. Coaching center is providing its service and is giving tuitions to people. Does it comply with information accessibility or communication accessibility. That means, can deaf people or blind people go take those tuitions on an equal basis with others? So that is a law. I know it's very difficult because most of us are habituated teaching either on boards or by speaking. So we don't do any sign language, we don't do any character or braille kind of information. We don't have braille notes. So we have a huge issue in including people with disabilities at workforce. The rules, which was framed in 2017, also have section 17, section 15 describes standards for various segments. It provides standards for bus body code, it provides standards for website accessibility, and it also provides for review of these standards from time to time. Generally 3 years is the time when these standards are reviewed. The law also has offenses and penalties. So first time a law of this nature has offenses and penalties. Section 89 provides for 10,000 rupees fine, which may extend to 50,000 rupees and extend to 5 lakh rupees, from 50,000 to 5 lakhs. Any person who contravenes any of the provisions of this act or any rule made thereunder shall, for the first contravention, be punishable with a fine which may extend to 10,000, and for any subsequent contravention, 50,000 to 5 lakhs. And this goes from the person's pocket. So this is a little scary this time, because if you don't provide accessibility, it is now a offense which is punishable under law. So the NBC clarifies that it is intended to make all buildings and facilities used by public accessible to and usable by all people, including those living with disabilities, and may include those with inability to walk or difficulty in walking, reliance on walking or mobility aids, blindness and visual impairments, speech and hearing impairments, incoordination of motor movements, cerebral palsy and other conditions, reaching and manipulation, where people can't, open the doors, they can't use the doorknobs, lack of stamina. So you have so heavy door that can't be opened. Look at your front door. I can always, relate to this building. The front door is so huge and so heavy, you can't think of even pushing it yourself. Difficulty in interpretation and reacting to sensory information and extremes in physical sizes. It supplements the general requirements of this part of the code and reflects greater concern for safety of life and limb of every resident, irrespective of age, gender, or abilities. So this is it sets the foreground in the code itself, that we are really looking to include everyone when it comes to building. Typically, building used to be designed for people who are like 6 feet tall, who have 2 hands, who have 2 legs, they can jump, run, hop, climb stairs, they can see, they can hear, slightest noise. Buildings are, and they're male. Buildings are typically designed for them. Females were out, disabled, people feeling disabled were out, elderly were out, children were out. And we found that these buildings were actually not suitable, safe, and usable by all people. So this design thinking has undergone a drastic change in the National Building Code 2016 that you see now. So let me come to what we have in this code. I'm not going in detail because time is short. The work that we did in 3 years is difficult to summarize in 1 hour, but I'm trying to touch upon essentials. There's a subject called Anthropometry that this code has dealt with, and it talks about a wheelchair. So every person should know what is wheelchair, what are the parts of the wheelchair, and so the components are described in the law, in the NBC. This is in particular to indicate how much space is required for a wheelchair to pass, and when the person is sitting and propelling himself, how much extra space, the elbow space, is required for the person to pass. So, for example, to make a 360-degree turn, you require 1800 millimeter minimum for a wheelchair, for activity space in front of any fixture. For example, a wash basin, or for example, a mirror. You require this much space, or drinking water fountain, wherever, or say ATM. So you require a 900 millimeter into 1200 millimeter space for a wheelchair to go, and the person can walk on that fixture. Similarly, you need 920 millimeter for people who are walking with crutches. It describes very well what height is required for your knee clearance when you're seated on a table, with a table. So, for example, if your knee clearance is not 680 millimeter, you won't be able to bring your knees in, under the table. So you will get stuck outside only. So imagine a person on a wheelchair, he won't be able to write anything on the table. So it would be almost this far. So that's the reason that these standards are brought in. For a person who's blind, you require at least 600 millimeter is the body space, and then you require 150 and 150 both sides, because typically this is the way that you use your white cane, to orient yourself in the surroundings. So the picture explains that. Similarly, in anthropometry, we also look at the common reach zones. When I say common reach zones which can be easily reached by people sitting on wheelchair as well as people who are standing. So this impacts all controls that we give. And we decide that, okay, all the controls should be within this particular height, so that people both who are standing, it shouldn't be too low for a person who's standing and shouldn't be too high for a person who's sitting. It describes minimum width of walkways and pathways, how much width is required when two wheelchairs will pass. It also provides for passing spaces where there is lack of space. So you say, okay, there will be passing space of say 1500 millimeter on the route, where a person, if two people are crossing, so one may be able to wait and other person can cross over. It describes ramps and various kinds of ramps. This is curb ramp. I'm sure those who have a civil engineering background would know about difference between a curb ramp and a normal ramp. Curb ramp is provided on a curb which is not more than 150 millimeter. That is one step. If it's more than that, it has to be a ramp. The major difference between a ramp and a curb ramp is that ramp will have a handrail on both sides. Okay, and handrail which extends further so that people can hold on to it and push themselves up the incline. Curb ramp does not have handrail. It just have one ramp and two flared curbs. So people on wheelchair can easily climb. It details out the requirements for making an environment accessible for blind people as well. People who have vision impairment. People with vision impairment orient themselves in the environment with help of cues. Cues that may be felt by their stick or cues that may be felt by underfoot. So these are tactile blocks, we call them TGSIs, tactile ground surface indicators. You must have seen them in metro, in bus queue shelters. If you have traveled abroad, I'm sure you must have seen at all public places.